It's hard to say no to mac and cheese, but when it comes to steak, you've just got to practice a little bit of self-restraint. From milk to sweets, these are the sides you should be keeping far, far away from your beef. The old ketchup on steak debate. We must say that no matter which opinion you have about this sweet and tomatoey condiment, one thing's for certain, and that is that you should never ever be caught slathering it on steak in public. Of course, it's absolutely true that what and how a person eats is their own business. However, you should know that putting ketchup on steak is a little frowned upon when it comes to entrees. A person could do it, but they'll have to have tough enough skin to bear the judgment of anyone who witnesses you making this culinary mistake. When it comes to steak, certain condiments, sauces, and pairings may help to accentuate its beefy nuances best, but it's best to leave that up to the professionals, and that's even assuming someone would want to add something to their steak in the first place. Thus, loading a steak down with ketchup at a fine dining establishment isn't recommended unless you want to anger the chef, even if it does taste really good.
That sets off the flavor of a steak like some ketchup.
As hard as it is to believe, according to some Redditors, there are people out there who like to take chunks of steak meat and dip it in applesauce. There are some meats out there that pair well with apples. For example, apples paired with pork is a common and delicious meal that defies expectations a bit. However, applesauce and steak is a much more questionable pairing. Besides not enhancing steak flavors, it could be argued that adding applesauce to virtually any dinner entree is reminiscent of an elementary school lunch. While it may not be unheard of for someone to have applesauce with their dinner, it isn't usually the most sophisticated pairing to serve with steak, especially when dining at a fancy steakhouse. Because steak is so rich and heavy, it typically pairs well with lighter options that can help balance everything out. Applesauce is indeed light, but it may be a bit too light and too sweet to really enhance the flavors of a savory steak cut. Tangy, bitter, and oh so bright, serving any of the many types of mustard on steak is a foreign concept to most, though there are some avid mustard devotees out there who are willing to try it, and even Mark Murphy uses the surprise ingredient alongside soy sauce for a steak condiment. Its zesty flavor more than likely works best on hot dogs, burgers, and other meat types. Now, does that mean that mustard and steak can never go together? Absolutely not. Actually, adding Dijon mustard to a steak marinade or even a beef stew can really help amplify flavors and give the meat a bit of something extra without being too overpowering. But it's important to understand that the addition of mustard to steak in these cases usually happens before the steak is cooked or during the cooking process. As for dishing up steak with a side of mustard after the steak has been served, well, that's something else entirely. Its slightly sour flavor conflicts with the already subtly bitter char some steaks carry, making for an overall pungent and unappetizing flavor experience. The light and distinct taste of sweets just doesn't fare well with some savory options like steak, for reasons that should seem pretty clear. Of course, there are some nuances to this rule. For one, steak almost always pairs beautifully with a red wine, some of which can be quite sweet. It's also the case that a slightly sweet cocoa rub can bring out some wonderful warm flavors in your finished steak. Those, however, are the exceptions. There are also people who like to saddle up loaded sweet potatoes alongside steak. These sweet potatoes often come heaped with brown sugar, cinnamon, caramel, marshmallows, and additional honey to make things almost offensively sugary. But while options like loaded sweet potatoes may be available on your local steakhouse menu, it doesn't necessarily mean that option goes perfectly with steak. Now, this one is one of those pairings that might justify bending the rules a little. Mac and cheese is technically a bit too rich to offer up with steak. Sure, it's melty, creamy, delicious, and could be paired with virtually anything. But when it comes to what would actually enhance the flavors and nuances of the meat, mac and cheese isn't exactly the best choice. Instead of something heavy, thick, and creamy like mac and cheese, steak typically pairs best with the likes of a light potato, salad, asparagus, and perhaps a nice glass of red wine. Mac and cheese, on the other hand, though featured on many steakhouse menus, may prove a bit too much in the flavor department, given its hearty texture and buttery rich taste. Having said this can be an awesome comfort food side dish if a person isn't afraid of receiving a couple of weird looks. It's also a very filling option when you're ravenously hungry. As depressing as it might be to accept, mac and cheese just isn't as much of a stellar option for steak as one would hope.
So what do you want to do for lunch? I can do mac and cheese or mac and cheese.
Believe it or not, some people love tomato sauce on steak, and although it could be seen as an upgrade to ketchup, it still isn't necessarily a great addition to steak. Tomato sauce is typically too bitter and acidic on its own, without a little help from a few seasonings and a dash of sugar. In addition, the taste of tomato sauce tends to be bland and flavorless when used straight out of the can. Thus, it's a bit difficult to understand how tomato sauce could, in any way, be deemed an acceptable dipping for a tender steak. It's definitely something that a person could try if they have no alternative and are desperate to not eat their steak by itself, but even then, it might be worth looking up a few homemade steak sauce recipes before dousing your steak with something we traditionally associate with spaghetti. Pasta is something that technically could work with steak, but it's not as typical of a pairing as chicken and pasta. And though you might find garlic and herb chicken served atop a bed of pasta, it's much rarer to find steak served in a similar fashion. Are we saying this would be totally gross? Not at all. This isn't to say that the pairing doesn't necessarily go together. Actually, depending on the cut and seasoning on your steak, as well as the type of pasta you use, it could actually taste quite good. Not to mention there are comfort dishes out there like beef stroganoff that would seemingly make this combination a-okay. Still, if someone plans on serving a tender and juicy ribeye with herbed linguine pasta to dinner guests, they may get weird stares and uncomfortable smiles at the sight of such a combination. Though it may technically taste okay, the two just aren't commonly associated with one another, which ultimately makes for an awkwardly paired entree, unfit for a fine dining experience. Is milk a soothing and satiating option to complement beef? It's possible, but as most people can attest, steak is best served with a light drink. A glass of red wine, whiskey, beer, tonic, or even plain water can do the trick. But thick and creamy milk might be better used for munching on some cookies after dinner. With that said, cooking milk in steak, though peculiar, actually isn't such a bad idea. In fact, it has gained a bit of a cult following after the fictional character Charlie Kelly from the popular series It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia helped make the dish popular.
How about your favorite food? What would that be?
Oh, milk steak.
What?
Milk steak.
You basically boil the steak in milk along with seasonings to render an oddly delicious dinner creation, though even this may still seem slightly weird. However, people seem to love it despite it being a uniquely strange flavor mashup. All in all, when it comes to slurping a glass of milk alongside a juicy steak, know that it isn't too common. For some, it may prove an even greater insult to the cow, since a person would be eating its meat while also drinking its milk. It's true that pairing fruit and meat can be tasty in its own right, but not so much when it comes to sampling fruit of any kind with steak. This isn't to say that some amazing fruit chutney or glaze wouldn't be delicious, it's just that there is no fruit that comes to mind that would do well on top of or served alongside steak. While it's normally true that lighter options pair best with heavier options, there's something about the sweet nuance of fruit when paired with the heavy and robust taste of steak that's quite off-putting. Unlike common pork options like the aforementioned pork chops and apples, there probably aren't many steak recipes offered up in quite the same way. As depressing as it might be for fruit lovers, fruit just isn't a go-to option when it comes to the best items to serve with steak. Serving beans of any sort with steak is both unconventional and unadvised, as their mushy texture and distinct taste are more commonly associated with barbecue and Mexican fare than the finest steakhouse offerings. Though the combination doesn't taste terribly bad, dishing up this interesting duo to unsuspecting guests may cause some objections at your dinner party.
What beans? There's beans?
There's beans.
Whether it be a texture issue or hitting the taste buds wrong, something about the duo just doesn't sit right. Still, according to Reddit, there are some out there who apparently see nothing wrong with it. One man states that his wife was shocked at his choice of dinner for the night, which of course was none other than beans and steak. While most commenters agreed with the original poster's wife that this mashup is definitely strange, for the original poster, this dinner selection was totally commonplace growing up. Despite the fact that it isn't a great option for steak as a side dish, sampling beans alongside a savory rack of ribs, fried cod, tacos, or even snappy hot dogs is a much better choice. Save your beans for one of these entrees instead. Yes, a person can totally put steak in soup, but serving soup as a side dish for steak? Although soup is indeed light and therefore would seem to fit the bill for a good steak pairing, the truth is that this kind of side dish simply doesn't work. It could be the savory matched with savory aspect here that causes things to get a bit muddled, especially since many soups already come served with a decent amount of meat in them. However, even a cream-based or vegetable-rich soup doesn't seem to quite cut it. Because soups are traditionally served with hearty sandwiches or a nice warm piece of crusted bread, it seems out of the norm to serve up something like a steak as a complimentary option. If you want veggies, it might be better to opt for something like a cool salad or steamed broccoli as a more acceptable side dish. Most of the pairings that have been reviewed thus far probably seem outlandish, but when it comes to potato chips, things get a bit confusing and divisive. Steak and potatoes are typically a match made in heaven. The quintessential mashed potatoes, steak, and salad setup is all too common, and while matching steak with fries starts to feel less formal, lots of people love it. So what could possibly be so wrong about pairing steak with chips? After all, they're potatoes too, right? Indeed they are, but potato chips are deep fried and typically associated with casual cuisine. It doesn't quite seem appropriate to take something so common and match it up with something as exquisite as a luscious steak entree. The only exception to this would be a steak sandwich or other casual steak fare, in which case a bag of chips would be totally acceptable.